All right, welcome to our very first Screencastified lecture. First of all, I want to go over what's due this coming week. You got SkyPack Module 8 on private prisons. That is due Thursday night. This Screencastified lecture is also due by Thursday night. And then for Friday, remember to do your Comparative Corrections Module 8. And that is where you need to find a second source about your country, not about the United States, but about your country. And a couple of things to keep in mind. Don't forget to provide the URL. Some people are losing points just for not following directions. Please include the URL. Please introduce in the first sentence your country. What country are you writing about? And then also try to find a different topic. So if you talked about um, women in prison in your country last time, try to find something on health, on tuberculosis. If you talked about overcrowding, try to find something else. So try to change it around so you learn all about the correction system as best as you can. And remember, just focus only on your country and some aspect of its correctional program. Okay, so what is privatization? It is a contract process that shifts public functions, responsibilities, and capital assets in whole or in part from the public sector to the private sector. And the in part is actually a really important piece of this definition because when people are talking about private prisons, invariably they are talking about the in whole. That is, they're generally thinking of prisons that were built and operated entirely by a private company. But the more common form of privatization is actually the in part, and that is where different facets of prison management are run by private companies that have been contracted to take over that aspect of, say, commissary or food or something like that. So that actually happens within public prisons. And we'll talk about all these different kinds of privatization. And so a lot of private prisons, for the most part, have really come into being in the 1980s, 1990s, and a lot of the controversy around them is quite recent. But actually, the very first prison to be operated by a private provider in the United States was at San Quentin back in the 1850s. But up until the 1980s, it was very rare to have private providers running prisons. So there's several different kinds of privatization. So the first one is this in part that we're talking about, and that is where specific services are contracted out to a private company. The most common would be commissary and food preparation, but you also have like medical care, so that like the State Department of Correction no longer handles the medical care. Instead, they contract out with a company that comes in and provides medical care, provides mental health services, maybe comes in and provides laundry services and that sort of thing. And some examples are Aramark, which in Indiana handles a lot of the food contracts. And here you can see this is their website. Down here you can see where food services. They also run commissary services and then also facility services. And so you can see here all that delicious spaghetti they get in prison. Those brownies, those wonderful meals. So there it is. And then Bob Barker, no relation to the former host of Price is Right, they actually, I don't know if they still do, but they used to contract with the Juvenile Detention Center, and they provide both commissary services. They also provide just sort of products like hygiene products and whatnot that the prison or in this case, the Juvenile Detention Center would sell or provide to the kids, to various inmates. And so you can see down here, they have really interesting stuff. They have security razors. They also have these flexible game pieces, just in case the chess game goes horribly, horribly wrong. You can't put somebody's eye out with it. They also have like the silicon dominoes, silicon checkers pieces, right? Because if it's hard plastic, you can shave that down into some sort of razor or a pointy object to hurt somebody with. And so they provide these kinds of things, which I don't know, it's kind of interesting. The second type is private sector development of facilities. So that's usually when people are thinking of private prisons, this is usually what they're thinking about. And this is where a private company goes in, builds the prison, and then runs the prison. So in this case, this picture is CCA, that's Corrections Corporation of America. They're no longer called that, they're called CoreCivic. But this would be an example where a company like Geo Group or CCA CoreCivic, they go in, they build the building, they hire the staff, then they contract with the state to house inmates within their facility. And that's usually what people are thinking of when they think of privatization. But the specific services is far more widespread. And in fact, I don't know that there's a single public institution at this point that doesn't have private contracting. And then there's the private management of a facility. So in this case, the company doesn't own the building, the state or the county owns the building, but they contract with a private company to come in and hire staff and basically run the building. And so an example of that, as you may know, is Marion County Jail. And so this is actually, again, the building is owned by the county. It's a county jail, but the actual administration and staffing and running the jail, management of the jail, is run by CoreCivic. Again, used to be CCA. So private prisons, again, we saw San Quentin was run by a private company back in 1850s, but really it was the 1980s when these things really kicked in. And so this is a quote from a report from the ACLU talking about the number of prisoners in private prisons increased by 1,600%, 1,600% between 1990 and 2009. And today, for-profit companies are responsible for about 6% of state prisoners, 16% of federal prisoners, and nearly half of all immigrants detained by the federal government. In 2010, the two largest private prison companies alone received nearly $3 billion in revenue, and their top executives, according to one source, each received annual compensation packages well worth over $3 million. And so this tends to be the underlying critique for a lot of people of private prisons is the profit motive that you can see here, $3 billion in revenue, highly paid individuals, executives at the top. And so that tends to be the primary underlying criticism. But what we're going to talk about is the arguments for private prisons and the arguments against private prisons. The two big companies in America are CoreCivic. Again, it used to be CCA. It was incorporated back in 1983, and now it's the fifth largest prison system in the U.S. So the biggest one would be like the California DOC. And then you've got the Federal Bureau of Prisons, right? So those are big. So number 5 isn't even a state. It's a company. It's CoreCivic, which is the fifth largest prison system in the country. It operates over 80 facilities. So again, they only own 50 of those facilities. The other ones, they would just come in to facilities that are owned by the state or the county, and they would run those facilities. They'd manage them and staff them and whatnot. They have over 85,000 beds, and they operate in 20 states and Washington, D.C. They hire 13,000 employees. 40% is federal. And you can go to their website here, and you can buy stock. So you can see here where they have their investors, and I think CoreCivic is something like CX. Can't remember their exact ticker. But over here you can get stock information, investor information. And you used to be able to get their, you can still get it, but you can get their PDF of like their reports, their projected earnings for the following year. You can see here their political and lobbying activity. And sometimes it was really kind of crazy to read some of their investor reports where they're predicting the future, saying, hey, things are going to be great. We're locking up more and more people. It was really kind of odd to read those things. Recently, their reports are a little less tone deaf, and they're a little less focused on their profits and more on the services they provide and their rehabilitation and whatnot. The other big company in America is Geo Group, and they used to be called Wackenhut. So kind of like Sprint used to be called MCI, these companies get in trouble. They need to rebrand, and so they just come up with a brand new name. And so you can see both of these companies have done that. And so it's much smaller than CoreCivic in America, but it's actually quite big worldwide. So they're only Geo Group is only 21% of the market share in the US of the private market share. CoreCivic has another over half of the private share. So together, they're three-quarters of the entire private prison market is just these two companies. And here you can go see theirs. And you can go look at their investor site. And what's interesting about, and I believe it was Wackenhut at the time, you can see here where they have their stock, their ticker, and their stock prices. They used to a couple decades ago when they first were really starting. They would actually have a body count. They'd have like a real-time counter of the incarceration number of people incarcerated in America, and it was on their investor page. So basically, they were saying, look at the people getting locked up. This is great for business. And people thought that was pretty tacky. And so eventually they took that down. One of the reasons why, of course, they're no longer Wackenhut. And this is just a little interesting side note is, stadiums get named. Companies will pay for the naming rights to a stadium. Geo Group had tried to purchase the naming rights to the new stadium at Florida Atlantic University. They are the Florida Atlantic University Owls, and this did not actually happen. This is an artist rendition of the proposal. People found out about it and just completely freaked out. They were calling it Alcatraz. People became very opposed to it, so it never actually happens. But this was an attempt by the Geo Group to name a stadium at a college in Florida, which is, I don't know, interesting. Arguments for privatization. Okay, contrary to what the critics of private prisons tend to say, there are actually some really valid arguments in favor of private prisons and some legitimate reasons why private prisons grew as quickly as they did in the 80s and 90s. Foremost, private operators can provide construction financing options that allow the government client to pay only for capacity as needed in lieu of encumbering long term debt. That sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Really, what that means is it's really expensive to build a prison. And while people continuously through the 80s and 90s voted to lock more people up, they would vote against the taxes needed to actually build the prisons in which to put these people. And so, if a Department of Corrections or a state or a county for that matter, trying to build a jail, needs more space, they might have to try to pass a referendum, try to pass a bond. And if those get voted down, it becomes very hard to pay for a new prison, which would cost, several $1 million up front to build. And so a private operator can come in, can finance the building of a prison. And then oftentimes what they might do is lease back the prison to the state. So the state doesn't have to pony up all that dough, which they don't have in their annual budget. They don't suddenly have an extra couple of $1 million to build a prison. So instead, a private prison can pay to build the prison and then provide those services or lease the services, the building to the government agency, which then would be an annual fee, an annual cost from their budget, which is much easier for government. Private companies offer modern, state of the art correctional facility designs that are efficient to operate. If you've been to some prisons around Indiana and across the country, some of them are very, very old. And when they are very, very old, they are not going to be very efficient, just in terms of basic utilities, electricity, HVAC, all those sorts of things, water. And so, just almost by definition, building a more modern building that's 75 years younger than what's out there, you're going to end up with much more efficient design, more efficient also in terms of security, more efficient in terms of utilities, uh, costs to run it. So that's a pretty good argument too for private prisons. The other big savings is, of course, labor. And so prisons, just like with other criminal justice agencies, courts, police, uh, a large chunk of the costs are labor. And so private companies, this is where the savings that come in from private prisons that they argue they can provide, is they hire new people, whereas existing prisons, by definition, are going to have people who've been there for a while. So they've received their annual raises, promotions, et cetera, et cetera. And so the costs continue to go up. So if you start a new prison and you hire new people at entry-level wages who are also non-unionized, you're going to pay them a lot less. This is also the problem with private prison savings, is what they have found is over time, private prisons are not cheaper than public prisons once you've gotten over that hurdle of the initial savings from hiring people, because then those people will actually get raises and they'll become long term. So over the long term, private prisons cost pretty much the exact same as a state prison. They aren't, in fact, any cheaper. The other consideration when you do these costs is that once you've now contracted out with a private company, there's new jobs that weren't there before. So like where I worked for the Salvation Army, we had people from the BOP whose full-time job was to go around and monitor contracts. And we were not a for-profit, we were a non-profit, but we had to contract with Bureau of Prisons. And so there's an entire new layer of bureaucracy that has to write the contracts, monitor the contracts, come in and do trainings and all that. And so that can actually, it's not going to be a huge expense, but obviously that's a new labor expense that wasn't there before, and oftentimes that doesn't get worked in when you're trying to make the argument that private prisons are cheaper. Private operators typically design and construct a new correctional facility in half the time of a comparable government construction project. So this is for any number of reasons, right? Private prisons can be built cheaper and faster than public prisons. On average, governments take 5 to 6 years to build a correctional facility. Some private companies claim they can do it in 2 to 3 years. So CCA, which you remember used to be CCA, at the time it was CCA when they did this, now they're CoreCivic, but they built a 350-bed detention center in Houston for immigration. They completed it in 5.5 months at a cost of $14,000 per bed. At the time, the INS had estimated that it would require 2.5 years and it would cost $26,000 per bed. So you can see where the private industry consistently, generally, is pretty much cheaper than the state. So this would be our discussion question: why might it be so much faster for private business? The reason is state governments and county governments, just governments generally, usually have to go through a much more long and drawn out bidding process. And one of the reasons for that is to prevent corruption. So if you remember from our convict leasing, if I come in and I'm running the prisons and I got a buddy who owns a railroad, it sets itself up for corruption. I just send all the convicts over to my buddy at a much cheaper price or an inflated price, or we pay them or something. And so the bidding process helps prevent that. So they have to sit there, they have to take a bunch of bids, they have to go through that. And so that ends up taking much longer compared to a private company is allowed to go and make deals with friends and whatnot. It's not the same because they're not spending taxpayer dollars, they're spending their own dollars. So that's one of the reasons why private prisons can be built much faster than public. So private vendors can also provide the government with accountability, right? And really convenience, because they only have to deal with one entity for all the compliance issues. So instead of a state prison who now has food services, commissary services, medical services, mental health services, et cetera, we have all these issues, all these different entities involved. Now they just have the one CCA or CoreCivic or Geo Group. That's it. So whatever it is, the food, the commissary, all these different things, it all comes back to this one company where they can be held accountable for everything, where you just have the one contract with the one organization who then handles everything. So it can be much easier for the government to just simply deal with one organization, one company, and let that company worry about all those other compliance issues. So this one, I don't know that I'm quite as convinced by this. Private corrections management companies provide economic development opportunities by hiring local and purchasing local, which is fine. I'm sure they do, but there's no reason why state or county correctional facilities also couldn't do this. So again, the states, the public facilities are somewhat hampered in that they're restricted by bidding systems, so they can't necessarily, might not have the flexibility, but for the most part, they can also do local. What this does raise is an interesting issue is historically in corrections and criminal justice, you have NIMBY, right? The not in my backyard, where people want drug treatment, but they don't want a drug treatment facility built next to their home. People want prisons, but they don't want to live by a prison. And so you have these problems where people want all these things, but they don't want them anywhere near them. Well, if nobody wants them near them, then where do you end up putting them? What's interesting though is in the 80s, as jobs, factory jobs started to be exported out to Asia, you would see these rural cities and towns would start to actually compete. So it almost became, it was like, yes, in my backyard. It would become very competitive, and politicians would really work hard to get a prison built in their rural community. And for a lot of rural communities, prisons sort of became the new factory jobs. Again, that doesn't have to be a private prison for that. That could also be a state prison. So government can reduce or share its liability exposure by contracting. So governments, right? Prisons, show me a prison and I'll show you a prison that's being sued. Prisons get sued a lot. These inmates and others have a lot of time on their hands, and so there's a lot of lawsuits. And again, if you remember that correctional facilities often, because they can't control the crowding, they can't control the number of people coming into their facility, they can get overcrowded. That can reduce the quality of conditions, that can lead to more lawsuits. And so if you just contract out with a private company, that private company assumes that liability. And they take on liability insurance and they handle all that. And so government sort of basically shelters really taxpayers from exposure to the different liabilities and expenses associated with that. And the government can retain flexibility by limiting contract duration. So if I'm a state and I build a prison, that's it. I'm stuck with that prison. So if, as we're seeing now in the last several years, prison populations start to go down, that doesn't really help me. I still own this big prison. But if I contract out with CoreCivic and I have a 10-year contract and prison populations are going down, at the end of that 10 years, I don't have to renew my contract. And so that's no longer an expense. So that kind of flexibility is very good for government, right? Which again, you're seeing sort of the risks taken on by a private company rather than by the government, which in the end is also the taxpayers. This is a big argument for privatization just generally. When it comes to certainly in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of growth and discussion and debate about privatizing the utilities, about privatizing trash collection, all these other things. And the argument is that if you inject competition, everybody has to get better. And so a public prison, a state prison, or a county jail has no reason to improve or become more efficient because they have no competition. They have their role, their mission, and they have the taxpayer dollars. And so the argument is, well, if now CoreCivic builds a facility and they're willing to do it for $5 a man less per day, then that injects some competition among everybody who doesn't want to lose their jobs. Right. So, as an example, in the 80s, as we've talked about, like Cook County Jail, these big urban jails, a lot of state prisons were all under federal consent decrees because of really bad conditions in the prisons, generally stemming from overcrowding. And so it's important to keep in mind, too, that the people who criticize private prisons if private prisons weren't around, they'd be laying the same criticisms against public prisons, right? Uh, Public prisons have the same problems as private prisons. And so to sit there and argue, oh, well, look at the conditions of this private prison, well, that's maybe true, but the public prisons have the exact same problems. And so the argument is that having this competition can force these prisons and jails to perform better. The problem with that argument is these jails weren't performing poorly because they didn't have competition. It's because Cook County couldn't control the number of people that were being hurled at them and forcing them to be so overcrowded, right? They didn't have the discretion. They were not recruiting inmates. They were just having them sent to them day in and day out. That led them to the problems that generally the education, all these problems stemmed from overcrowding. So it's not lack of competition, it was lack of control over the population. Another important thing to keep in mind is you'll see every now and then these critics of private prisons will point out to a riot, like in Indiana. I think it was like a year or two before I moved to Indiana, there was a riot in the state at a private prison. Well, it's important to remember that the biggest, worst riots in America happened at state prisons. Attica, which was the most people died, like the bloodiest riot, happened. That was a state prison, and then easily the worst, most horrible prison riot it was in New Mexico. I encourage you to Google that. It was a horrific, and that was also a state prison. And so to sit there and act like state prisons were somehow so much better than private prisons is really disingenuous. State prisons have had a lot of problems, and it's important to keep in mind that both basically are the same. One's really not better than the other. And then also where you have private prisons, you can sort of help control the costs for unionized labor. The prison guards in California are highly unionized and very powerful, and they are seriously paid. They are paid really well. And so by bringing in private companies that can hire non-union work, you really help control these expenses. Okay, that said, there are also a lot of really good arguments against private prisons. One is really kind of a philosophical argument, and that is that there are just some things that should not be handled by private entities, private companies. That some things that is basically that's why we have governments. Like these are the responsibilities of government. So even the most extreme libertarians generally agree that the role of government is at least to provide national defense, right? So you don't want to privatize out the army and the navy. That's why we have government. The point of government is national defense. So other people would argue, well, there's other things just like that. One would be crime, that the whole point of government is just like national defense is defense of the community, is to establish laws for what you can and cannot do, enforce those laws, and punish the wrongdoers. So the apprehension and conviction of offenders are public responsibilities. We should not have private companies do that. It doesn't even make sense, right? It's not necessary. It's not even so much that it's wrong. It's beyond that. That's the point of government, is to do exactly that. So it's one thing to privatize trash collection and utilities. It's something else entirely to privatize what is the basic function of government, which is national defense, which is the establishment of laws and the enforcement of those laws. And then this is the profit motive, of course, we talked about with convict leasing and with prison industry. This is where I talked about a lot of the criticisms of prison industry. You'll see them sort of slide back and forth between privatization and prison industry as if they're the same thing. They are not the same thing at all. One thing that ties them together is this concern over the profit motive. And as we saw with the profit motive with convict leasing, they, when you look at like the example where Tallahassee signed a contract with the lumber company in Wisconsin, and suddenly they lock up 800% more people for vagrancy. Like the profit motive is definitely something that should not be part of punishing individuals. It should not be a profit to punishment to law enforcement. That doesn't make any sense, and it leads to perverse incentives. And of course, that's the prisons are paid by the number of prisoners. Just like I mentioned, where Geo Group, then Wacken had a basically the incarceration, not the rate, the number of people locked up in America, and their investor page. That's crazy. That's not a healthy way to go about correctional policy at all. And so this is like I was saying, this is where convict leasing and reprivatization. Some people argue this isn't a new thing, privatizing prisons. We are reprivatizing prisons because convict leasing was the original privatization of prisons. So from your Sky Pack, there's this. I just kind of cut this out of your Sky Pack. From 1999 to 2010, the Sentencing Project found that CCA, so again, 1999 to 2010, it was called CCA, now it's called CoreCivic, spent on average $1.5 million per year lobbying at the federal level and employed a yearly average of 70 lobbyists at the state level. In California, where state law requires lobbyists to disclose their contributions in detail, we know that CCA used its resources to support, among other things, additional adult and juvenile prisons and detention centers. So you have private companies spending millions of dollars to lobby to build new prisons for profit. So that's an example of what you really do not want in correctional policy and criminal justice policy. So, but I also found online this, and this is, I think it's from the LA Times. This is about the public prison guard union. So this is the public. This isn't the private industry. And so in 1988, which this is really right, the prison boom, amid debate over building a new state prison in LA, the group being the prison guard union, audaciously gave a $10,000 award to a Republican lawmaker who cut short her medical leave to vote for it. There was a swagger too and large campaign contributions to the gubernatorial campaigns of Pete Wilson in 90 and 94. The officers union switched political party loyalties in 98, putting $2 million into the campaign of Democrat Ray Davis to succeed Wilson. Both governors agreed to pay raises and champions tough on crime laws. So you have prison guards lobbying for tough on crime, that is, extending the sentences of prisoners to basically increase the populations in prisons in California, where we had the three strikes laws. And then, of course, for pay raises. That's not what you want. You do not want prisons, whether they're public or private, lobbying, right? That's not their job. Their job is to enforce the correctional policy that's put in place. But instead, you see them for basically for profit motives lobbying for longer sentences. And I just thought these were kind of fun. These are examples of products, just like we saw the silicon chess pieces and dominoes and whatnot. These are just some interesting, clear things. So people can hide contraband very easily in various devices inside really anything. They'll pretty much hide it. If there's a crack or an orifice, contraband will be hidden in it. So those see-through things are pretty useful for prisoners. One big issue has been communications, so that prisons, you have to usually place, in order to make a phone call if you're a prisoner within a prison, you have to collect calls. Well, the costs of those calls are nowhere near what they are in the free world. Like, they cost way more. And their argument is, well, we have all these extra security measures we have to keep in place to make sure prisoners aren't, using the phone to call in hits or make drug deals or talk to their gangs or anything like that. But this is a report from the FCC, from the Federal Communications Commission, where they say, while we generally prefer to promote competition to ensure that inmate phone rates are reasonable, it is clear that this market, as currently structured, is failing to protect the inmates and families who pay these charges. A significant factor driving these excessive rates is the widespread use of site commission payments, fees paid by the calling service providers to correctional facilities or departments of corrections in order to win the exclusive right to provide inmate phone service. So again, this is a massive profit motive. This would be that component or the facet privatization, not a private prison, but it's the private company coming in to provide one specific service, phones. And in this case, they're kicking back money to the correctional facility or to the DOC. It's like, hey, you give us this contract, you let us charge these excessive rates, these really high rates to these prisoners and their families, and in exchange, we'll kick back 10% of what we make to you. Well, that's not cool. So also critics point out that even though there's this argument that competition is good for correctional practice, in fact, there's not really a lot of competition. If you remember, 75%, three-quarters of the entire private prison market is controlled by two companies, right? That's not a free market. That's not an open market. That's an oligopoly, where you have only a couple of companies that actually are able to provide that service. And when you have that situation, then the prices, as we've seen, actually don't go down. So like I said, CCA, CoreCivic with GeoGroup control about 75% of the prison populations. And then in an area, in a region, one company through political ties and whatnot can actually be sort of a monopoly. So it might just be that nationally it's an oligopoly, which you don't want. Locally, it could end up being a monopoly where Geo Group controls the entire area because they've become ingrained in that local political atmosphere. This other concern is that governments may lose the capacity to perform these functions. So if the DOCs, the more they start contracting out services, the less that DOC has its own individuals in leadership positions who know how to run those kinds of services. And so, the talent comes from below. So you promote people up, you develop talent who then have the skills and the abilities to run these different organizations, to provide these different services. And if you contract that out to another company, if that other company decides to double its price, and you say, well, no, we'll just do it ourselves, well, it turns out you no longer have people who are skilled and able to do that. And so there is the concern that the more you privatize the stuff out, going back to this idea of competition, you just aren't going to be able to do it yourselves after a while. And in the end, it's not really all that much cheaper. So the big argument that's always historically been in favor of privatization is that it's cheaper. But a lot of studies are finding, in fact, it isn't, that it starts off cheaper, as I talked about, because you can hire new employees who, by definition, are going to be cheaper. They're going to work for less because it's entry-level positions. But over the long run, it isn't any cheaper. So the NIC, which is very much a mainstream correctional organization through the federal government, actually did a study of a private versus a public juvenile facility, and they found that it was basically the exact same. So the cost was the same. In addition, they also found there was, in fact, lower staff morale at the private prison. And then another major problem is that private prisons get a lot of their savings through cherry picking. And so, again, you see this with other programs in corrections and courts and that sort of thing, where like a drug treatment program, they compete for basically the people they know are going to succeed in their program because that improves your recidivism rates, which is how you're judged. Private prisons kind of do the same thing, except they're shooting for people who are cheap. So again, they're getting paid per person per day. And so if they can get the people who are cheaper, but still charge the same, they end up increasing their profit margins. And so, as we've talked about, the aging population is very expensive, right? So we have entire prisons now dedicated to the elderly because they have all these American with Disabilities needs. They have hospice where they're going to die in prison, and that's very expensive. They have obviously a lot more health problems. So that's really expensive. And then, of course, you have people with just chronic health conditions or mental illness and all those sorts of things that cost a lot of money to take care of them while they're in prison. So these private prisons have been cherry picking to where they end up ruling those people out as part of their contract, which helps them increase profits. Whereas the state prison now gets stuck, and that's the taxpayers, right? Get stuck covering the bills for these high need prisoners. So this is kind of a fuzzy chart, but it shows it to me. It shows it really well where the gray is the percentage of public prison population that's over the age of 50. And people generally estimate that if you're a prisoner, your age is, in terms of health, is about 10 years older. So a 50-year-old in prison is the equivalent of a 60-year-old in the free world. And you can see that these gray bars in all these different states, Arizona, Colorado, California, et cetera, the private prisons have considerably fewer of the elderly. And again, this is a growing problem for American corrections generally, but it's also a really heavy expense. And so the private prisons come in and they go, oh, yeah, we can do everything cheaper. Just don't give us the expensive inmates. Well, that doesn't really help the state in the long run, who ends up having to then take on an overrepresentation of these groups.